what story do you imagine while you're listening to this excerpt? Doing this one at a time and in a sound attenuated booth and just typing out what it is they imagined. It turned out that then we came back on the other side and looked, person after person. Not only was it very easy for them to imagine a story while listening, not only was that a very natural kind of response, but also they were imagining basically the same story to the same excerpts, even though we're not talking about excerpts that people have heard before. They're unfamiliar excerpts, including this works for music from some culture where people have never heard the music from that culture.
It's so weird.
It's so weird. And the first thing that happened was
there's just so much variance in human experience to start with. So the fact that you get an output that is somewhat consistent is kind of wild.
Like people's intuitions that they're really subjective and idiosyncratic, and then the reality that everyone else imagined the same thing. Music is sort of a way in to this web of associations that we've developed by just being in the world. And so kind of what we're imagining is telling us something about ourselves and the experiences we share with other people. And
Dr. Elizabeth Margulis is a music cognition researcher and professor at Princeton University whose work has revealed something deeply unsettling about the human mind, that the daydreams you think are uniquely yours are actually shared by strangers. She runs Princeton's Music Cognition Lab, was trained as a concert pianist, and is the author of On Repeat and the new book Transported, The Everyday Magic of Musical Daydreams. Remember to subscribe if you want to find out whether your most private inner experience was ever really yours at all.
Specifically in response to that, developed and validated a creative agency scale where we measure the extent to which people feel like they had free will over these imaginings. And there's this interesting divide where people think it's theirs alone, but it's really this kind of shared experience. What we experience as spontaneous thought is maybe more grounded in perception and in kind of memory and collective experience than we ordinarily acknowledge, and that music is a way, because it's this kind of structured ambient cue, we can kind of identify these patterns in a more robust way.
Dr. Elizabeth Margulis, for the listener at home that's maybe unfamiliar with you or your work, what's the most important context for them to understand your life journey, your science, and your mission?
I started out as a performing pianist at a conservatory. So I loved music. I was so excited about learning everything about it. But as I found myself at this conservatory, it was in this square block in a downtown area. It was gated. And I just found that I had all these questions that I actually couldn't answer within the boundaries of those gates. And it was only when I defied my teacher's express instructions and took the bus to an affiliated university and took a class in cognitive science that I thought, here are a set of methods and techniques for answering questions that I could bring to some of the things that had made me curious about music in the first place.
Really cool. I don't think I got a single lecture slide on music and the brain in my neuroscience degree. I don't think a single lecture slide was done on that.
That's something that has really changed in recent years and is something I'm so excited about. Because I think for so long, really the reflexive model about human communication was language, right? Because you definitely had lots of modules about language, right?
Yes.
And first work on music was very much, how can we take these models developed to understand language and look at music in terms of those frameworks? And gradually across time, we've sort of flipped the script a little bit and started to develop frameworks specifically for music. And then you can ask cool things like, well, in what ways is language actually sometimes doing something musical?
Very cool. Let's dive into that. Walk us through a day in the music cognition lab. What kind of experiments are done? What kind of science? What kind of questions are you interested in?
We're really interested in understanding how it is that something like listening to music where there's very little behavioral evidence of what might be happening, right? You might see people moving around, right? They might hum a little bit, but it can be a pretty surface apparent passive experience, but they can be having all kinds of really, really deep experiences underneath. And we want to understand what those experiences are like, what gives rise to them, and what that tells us about the human mind more broadly. So we basically use the whole suite of tools that we have at our disposal. We really view our group here at Princeton as a nexus between work in the humanities and the arts and the sciences. So we're interested in things like ethnographies of music in different cultures, and then trying to really formulate questions out of that in really precise ways that we can then bring into a behavioral paradigm where we'll, have people come in, put them in a sound attenuated booth, play them some music we've never heard before, have them do a task related to it, measure something and analyze something about that. We also do neuroimaging work down at the Princeton Neurosciences Institute, a couple buildings away, where we'll use things like MRI to get a better sense of what's going on in people's brains while they're listening to music.
Very cool. Well explained. I'm curious to dive into that. What does a brain look like when it's listening to music?
So this is something where over time, our understanding has really developed. I think initially there was this kind of reflexive sense that there should be some music center, right? And this is really not at all what emerged. Rather, what seems to be so interesting about music and the brain is what a distributed network music, even music listening, relies on, let alone music performance. And that perhaps some of the benefits we see from participating in music that are documented in the kind of developmental literature and more broadly might have to do with the way that music really forces you to get all those regions of the brain talking to one another. And sort of as time has moved on, like, let me just give you some examples. Even when you listen passively to music, motor areas of your brain come online and are active as you track the beat. So
Oh.
this may seem familiar to you if you've ever kind of been sitting still and listening to music, but you have some kind of irresistible sense of movement. That's really a real thing. And then lots of work about kind of the sensory perception aspect, and then things like memory and cognition and how you recognize a tune that you might have heard before, how you that all then comes together to give rise to emotional response. And then most recently, work in our group, we're interested in the imaginings that people have when they listen to music. So you might listen to a song and it sends you back into a really important personal memory, or it irresistibly just conjures up some really specific scene, some fictional scenario that's never actually happened to you. Um, and we've been able to see that when these kind of quasi semantic experiences are happening, that there's activity in the default mode network of the brain that is also present when you're doing things like mind wandering and thinking about what you might do next or things that have happened to you in the past. Music can really provide a scaffold for that kind of imagination.
Incredibly cool. Is so it's a very decentralized, distributed brain activity. Does it look any different to, say, someone's brain if they're listening to a lecture? Like, is it the same sort of distributed auditory processing, or is there some, musical signature in the brain that we can point to, even if it's not a particular nuclei or a particular region? Is there something that looks distinct about a brain with music?
Yes, great question. Yeah, so first of all, this motor component really seems to be special. So if you think about when you listen to a speech stream, it has all these temporal properties, but not this regular beat in this quite the same way that orients you to the sound in this kind of movement way. That's one key feature. And another is this relationship between uh, how you're predicting the sounds that are going to come next in the music you're listening to, which is also something you're doing when you're listening to speech, right? You have this capacity for statistical learning where you know when you're listening to a speech stream, for example, what syllable's likely to come next after the one you just heard. Same thing for music. So you are kind of listening ahead and anticipating what notes might come next. But the way that violations in those expectations play into your emotional response is different in music. So there's something really special about these anticipatory processes and how surprises play out and give us this tinge of, affect and emotional response while listening. That is different than what's happening in language.
Cool. I wonder if that motor cortex activity is in any way predictive of if someone is likely to dance. Like, I'm the kind of person that if there's music playing, I won't even, it feels like completely without my conscious control, I will get up and just start flailing arms around the place and like moving, and I'll just start dancing. And it doesn't feel like there was any free will or agency in that decision, but like music is playing, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to go up and dance. And I wonder, is that motor cortex activity, which starts just tapping out a beat, that's what kind of drives that impetus to just get up and you can't help it now. I gotta start dancing. Have you looked at that at all, or does that seem crazy?
No, it does not seem crazy. I've got actually a PhD student, Karen Christensen, whose dissertation really looks at exactly what you're describing. She's interested in imagined experiences of music, right? So there's some period maybe before you can't take it anymore and you're doing the flailing you just described, where you're feeling it and you're feeling kind of drawn into it. And there's like this imagined kinesthetic component. She's trying to look at that. And it comes out of a long line of literature in the cognitive science of music, where people have tried to understand groove. And what music science means by groove is the kind of music that has this effect where it irresistibly seems like it's making you want to get out of your seat and move. And certain songs are reliably rated by people as high groove. Think of Stevie Wonder's Superstition, I don't know, Michael Jackson, what have you, and others quite low groove, right? Like think here maybe medieval plain chant, right? Pretty hard to get out of your seat listening to that. And so an interesting question is, what makes some music high groove and what makes some music low groove? And how can that help us understand how the brain processes stimuli in time and, how you get these kind of perception action loops. And one of the things that comes out of that literature goes back to this concept of prediction, where you're synchronizing with a beat. You have these predictions about what's going to happen next. And in particular, high groove music seems to both formulate those predictions in a strong way, so give you some kind of temporal evidence that you can really lock onto, but then also mess with you slightly. So do something slightly unexpected. And that's something about that cocktail, that mix between predictable and
Interesting.
unpredictable, seems to trigger this impulse to move.
If you're anything like me, then you thought that skin irritation was just a part of shaving. 2 out of 3 men believe this, and it's because it's what these multi-head cartridges do. They're built for flexibility, but that flexing creates uncontrollable movement on the skin, which causes deep damage and irritation. Well, Henson shaving did the science, and on this channel we love a good experiment. 59 volunteers shaved one side of their face with a Henson and the other shaved using a multi-blade cartridge. They then used multispectral near-infrared spectroscopy. This is the same imaging tech they use in neuroscience research. Quite shockingly, they found that the multi-blade cartridges that are advertised to us constantly did 50% more skin damage than the Henson blade. Why is this, you ask? Well, the team behind the Henson are literally aerospace engineers. They build parts for the International Space Station and the ExoMars rover. This razor is machined to tolerances of 5/10,000th of an inch. The blade sticks out less than a width of hair. 30-degree fixed angle, no wobble, no flex. When the blade can't vibrate, it can't flex and cause that inflammatory cascade in the skin. It's metal, it has a really premium feel, and honestly, when I use it, I feel like James Bond in that scene where Moneypenny is using the cutthroat razor. Just has a really nice feel to it, as opposed to these garbage plastic ones that I've been using my whole life that are actually causing more damage. Henson are giving Giant Shoulder listeners 100 free blades with your purchase of a razor using the link in the description with the code The Giant Shoulder. Once again, 100 free blades, that's over 2 years worth. Use the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
Interesting. I'd like you to unpack that a little bit more, because so I've spoken to a lot of key figures in this predictive brain space, and I find it so fascinating. Anil Seth, Carl Friston, and I was excited to get into this predictive brain aspect with music. But unpack that a little bit more with groove. We'll make something groovy. It's something to do with how the predictions you're making about a temporal beat, and then as you're acting it out, it's like your predictive model is then like in sync with reality, with the music. And is that sort of right? You kind of unpack that, because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, here are some things to know that are special about how people synchronize with a beat as opposed to non-human animals, who in recent years we have discovered through the glory of the internet can also actually move to a beat. So I don't know if you've seen, Snowball, who can have you seen this bird rocking out to the Backstreet Boys?
I don't
This
think
is
so, but the audience are going to be watching that video right now, because I'm definitely putting
yeah.
that I'm definitely putting that on screen. That sounds amazing. I think I might know the bird, but I'll have to check afterwards.
Yeah, so Snowball's pretty amazing, but when non-human animals, or even when they can synchronize to a beat, it tends to be after. So the beat's happening regularly, and then the animal is responding to that and moving accordingly. Whereas in humans, when we're synchronized to a beat, we're slightly in advance of it. So what feels like perfectly in time to us is actually a little bit early.
I think in my case it's a lot off usually, but I think I'm crushing it, and I'm probably quite off.
There are good tests you could take in the internet to find out where your beat perception, truly lies in the
I'll have to do that.
distribution of skills.
Yeah, I'll have to do that. That'll be fun.
Yeah, because there is, sorry that this is a slight tangent, but there's a clinical battery for what's called amusia. And so that can involve, not being able to really detect when pitches are off, or when rhythm is off from, there are people who just really, really don't have that ability to distinguish, even when things are quite off. And but I'll tell you that typically when people say they're in music and then take the assessment, they turn out not to be. So I think there's more just like cultural anxiety about music performance than there is actual deficit in terms of it.
Yes.
Anyway, okay, so people are predicting the beat and find this quite natural and pleasurable, whereas when we find this in non-human animals, they had to be like elaborately trained for the most part. It's not something that emerged spontaneously. So if you think about a universe where you're predicting the beat, you're slightly early, you're anticipating it. Think about something like syncopation. So syncopation is a musical term that refers to cases where the accent that's happening in the music is actually off the beat. So you know where the beat is, but the thing that's really striking in the music is somewhere else. And that, broadly speaking, is a very groovy phenomenon, just the phenomenon of syncopation overall. And I mean, you intuitively, this will make sense to you, even if you haven't nerded out with music theory terminology. Just any moment, basically, that like whatever's happening in the music feels like super punchy and kind of drawing you out. That's often a case where syncopation is happening. And just definitionally, what syncopation is there's a whole bunch of activity at a place in the music that actually does not exactly align with the beat.
Right.
And so that's really pulling you in some way, that can feel quite physical and embodied, and depends on, something happening that is violating your basic predictions.
Yeah.
Because generally what we predict is for the juicy stuff to happen on the beat. We know this because if we play people music with a beat and then we do something like change a note a little bit or introduce a little error, people are really good at detecting that if it's on the beat. But the further it gets kind of around the beat, the less they notice that that happened. Because what a beat is, in many ways, is a moment in time where you're allocating attention, especially. This is an important moment. I'm going to especially listen there. Um, so we know that people are really anticipating things to happen on the beat. And so when they happen at a moment that's not on the beat, something special engages.
Interesting. It feels analogous to, in content creation, there's this idea of like a pattern break. So to hook someone's attention, you set up something and then you set up like an expected result and then you break that pattern. So it's like you give them some sort of idea of what's going to happen, but then you say, oh, actually, it's not that, it's this. And then that's what kind of hooks the attention. That's consciousness going online, like model prediction has significantly deviated from reality. Now I am aware of the situation. And then the idea is like aligning that model break back into a sort of framework they can understand. I
It
think
then
this
makes
is,
that
yeah,
right.
there might be some analog here.
That makes me think a lot about the case of earworms in music. So this is another phenomenon that really seems to separate music from language.
Yes.
We don't tend to get spoken utterances stuck in our head with the same regularity that we get tunes stuck in our head. And so similarly to the tendency to move, people, in addition to looking at what makes music groovy, people have also looked at in a technical sense, by the way, groovy in the sense of like the music cognition literature of what makes you want to move. People have also looked at what makes music catchy, what makes it get stuck in your head on repeat when you didn't intend for that to happen. And again, here, something has to be predictable enough that you can absorb its structure, quite easily, and have a framework for understanding it. But there's some hook, just like you're describing,
Right.
where things get a little off, and then that seems to generate this stuckness where you have this little snippet that seems to play and replay
Yes.
on repeat.
Because things get boring if your model of the world perfectly matches reality, right? That's when you zone out and it's like, oh, well, there's nothing interesting here. What I expect to happen is exactly what's happening at every point. It's funny how musicians, stumbled upon these things and filmmakers stumbled upon these things without knowing that there really is the neurological and the neuroscience underpinning to this and why it works and what's actually
We
happening.
see this again and again in our field, is that artists do something cool and figure something out, and
Yeah.
it's the science following. I seem to often think it would be the other way around, but it's just exactly from artists to scientists
Yes.
in experience. And this idea about repetition and saturation and surprise is really easy. Well, a generation ago, it used to be really easy for people to conceptualize because it was tightly linked to the top 40 song cycle,
Right.
which is, when radio was dominant. And you'd get these songs that would kind of play on these predictable cycles across the course of weeks. They'd kind of like ratchet up and become ubiquitous and then kind of fade away, and something else would come in. And, when we used to listen to music that way, it was incredibly obvious what was happening because, a song would come on the first few times and you'd be like, this is pretty terrible, and then you just kind of keep running into it. And then before you know it, you were kind of like singing along, and then you were, buying the album or whatever.
Yeah.
And then fast forward a few weeks and you were totally sick of it. And so it's just this kind of society level behavioral evidence of the way this trajectory works. But you can kind of, there's lots of good work showing that how long it takes before you saturate to something and start getting tired of it varies depending on how complex and unfamiliar it is to you. So if it starts out really simple, you can't really take a lot before it gets annoying. But if it's got some stuff going on that's novel and interesting, it takes you longer to acclimate and come down the other side in terms of liking.
Interesting. I find this is all super interesting because I'm thinking about when I go to a bar with my friends and they're playing some sort of classic pop music that's overplayed everywhere, and I'm like, oh, this is so much fun, this is great, let's get up and dance, and all my friends are like, oh, this music's terrible. And that, so exactly what you're saying is what's happened, that for some reason my brain maybe requires more of it to be saturated by the music than my friends who are maybe more, they're probably more music literate, and I'm like, oh, this is garbage. Where I'm like, just let's get up and have some fun. But it's interesting again to get some theoretical underpinnings to these things because I would have had no idea of any of that.
Yeah. And I think what you're seeing there is that, what is new to one person can be very old to another person, right? If they're using the same structures that your friends have listened to all the time, right? Whereas maybe you don't listen to that music as much, it's novel to you. And so, you might be able to rock out to it a little bit longer than your more jaded friends.
Yes, exactly. I'll call them that next time. Um, I've always been along this vein of the predicting brain. I've always been fascinated with optical illusions. You know, how easy it is to fool the most complex system in the known universe. Something I learned from your work is that we have a bunch of auditory illusions as well. I think this is super interesting. So talk about these auditory illusions that you've discovered.
So my favorite actually goes back to a discovery of, on the science side, of Diana Deutsch, who's one of the real founders of the field. Um, Again, following up on practices that had been in music for some time, where you could repeat a snippet of speech, and across the course of those repetitions, um, notice that the speech grip on your way of perceiving the world seems to kind of fade away. And what's left is the sense that you're hearing song. So let's say I, you know, have a conversation with you, we record it, take out one little bit, repeatedly play that over the course of 30 seconds or a minute or so, go back, play the recording of the whole conversation. What it ends up sounding like is normal conversation. And then when you get to the part that you heard repeated, it's like a Disney musical. We've just bust into song. And what I love about that is that there's nothing that has changed in the acoustic signal. You can listen to the same, recording. And it's, what has changed is simply that you've heard it repeated. And now you're orienting to it musically. So um, for me, that's not only kind of fun and puzzling, but also has these kind of deep insights to offer about what it means to listen to something musically.
Yes.
And you can kind of engage in this thought experiment where you're like, wow, that really does sound different. What sounds different about it? And now you're able to kind of tap into a little bit about what it means perceptually to hear something as music.
Yes. It's a really good example of what we perceive as our experience is our models of the world and not necessarily the exact stream of information that are coming into our senses at any time. Like those sound waves are being transduced by the cochlea and our auditory cortex and all of that in the exact same way. But since our predictive brain is the one that's generating the experience, maybe it's saying, well, this is repeating. And what usually repeats as a sound? A song, right? Would that be like, and so it sort of expects that, okay, well, this is repeating sound that I'm getting. Usually what sound that does repeat is music. So I must be listening to music. And then it just starts increasing all of the musicality. I don't know exactly what that does. Have you done a brain scan in that moment where it switches from music to not music? I'm curious, is there a change in brain activity when it goes from speech detection to clearly this is more musical now?
Yes, people have done that. And the way that design works is there's this guy in the UK, Adam Tierney, and he developed a set of snippets from audiobooks where half of them transform to song over repetition quite easily, and half of them are stubborn and keep sounding like speech. And so what he does is uses the transforming examples and the non-transforming examples and looks at what changes in the brain across the examples that come to sound like music that does not change in the examples that continue to sound like speech. And, again, what you see there is this kind of motor engagement that really is different than what tends to come online ordinarily during speech perception. One kind of overarching theory that I have about what it's like to listen to a lot of music compared to speech is this sense of shared participation. So, there have even been people that have gone and done these large scale studies where they just asked bunches of people to freely describe their peak experiences of music. So, the most amazing kind of listening experience ever had in their entire life. And one of the things that people tend to say when they've had a really deep experience of music is that they feel like they've kind of come out of themselves somehow and they've merged with the music. They're somehow a part of it. And in my kind of sense of what it's like to listen to music, even in everyday contexts, there's some transportive aspect there where, there's this subject object confusion a little bit more than when we're listening to most speech. We're kind of like humming along or partaking it in some way in this imaginative component. And that's part of what makes it feel so connecting and have such an important role in interpersonal understanding and social bonding.
And do you think that's, millions of years of evolutionary wiring or hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary wiring that makes music this really primal thing that we have evolved along for a very long time? Or is it cultural programming in 2026, or is it bits of both like it usually is?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think everything's all
Yeah, it's
intertwined with
always,
each
yeah.
other, right? You can't really pull them apart. But I will say that one of the most influential current theories about music's origins uh, does focus on its role in social bonding. And part of that is because we see some really robust effects there, across multiple experimental paradigms that are really suggestive and interesting. I'm thinking here, for example, of work by Laura Sorelli, where she took toddlers and strapped them to the front of a person, yeah, on the little front carriers. Do you know what I'm talking about? So they're
Yeah,
looking forward,
yeah.
and then they're looking at an experimenter, and then the babies either bounced in time, in sync with the experimenter, or out of phase. Okay, and then the baby's set down on the floor, and the experimenter pretends to have something befall them. So it's like they drop something and they need help, and they show that they need help, and then the whole point of the experiment is now to measure the helping behaviors that the toddlers show. And
Interesting.
Laura has these incredible videos where when the kids have been bounced in sync, they're readily coming over and like helping out and giving the experimenter what they dropped. And in the cases where they, were bounced out of phase, they just look a little weirded out and like turn around and leave the room. So
That's
there's
so
this way
funny.
that like moving together in sync and orienting in time jointly creates this kind of affiliation or sense of shared identity. And it's in multiple. We see this in multiple studies. So it seems like a really robust effect. And that's just crazy because if you look at the world, what do we need more of possibly than kindness and mutual understanding? And so, it seems almost, unbelievable
Yeah.
that something as simple as kind of a music-based intervention might move the dial on that at all. So that's something that people are really interested in, both from a applied perspective, like how can we use this actually in the world, and also from a basic science perspective, what does this tell us about, who we are and where we came from and, what makes us tick.
Yeah. That sounds like the most adorable science experiment that's ever been done.
Yeah, yeah, I
There's an
agree.
award for just literally the most adorable experiment ever done. I'm picturing, because they're those little carriers are so cute anyway when their little arms just kind of flail around and they're like that's adorable. It's such a that's such a cool experiment. I hope it replicates. You know, it's kind of one of those ones where you're like, did that replicate? I hope it does, because it's like that's a really cool finding. But it's, you know, totally one of those
Totally.
ones that I can imagine being, you know, replication crisis, because it
So,
just,
and right, and that's where it's interesting that there are multiple studies using different paradigms, like where kids, in one this a study by Tomasello and colleagues, they have kids walk around. They play a game basically that's either musical or it's not musical. So it's a similar game as you possibly can have. But in one case, you're kind of doing musicy things and moving together in time. In the other, you're doing something very similar that doesn't have that shared temporal component. And then they just have the kids who did this together use a big tube that has been cruelly rigged to break halfway through their play together. And then the kids have a choice. They can either keep having a blast with their whole marble contraption or, stop and help their compatriot, fix what happened to them so they can go back and play together. And also there, even though it's quite a different design, it's a different older kids, they're seeing this same effect, that moving together in time seemed to have this strong effect. So I agree, it's the kind of thing that is so striking that it warrants lots of exploration, but
yeah.
it's tantalizing to see it cropping up in all these kinds of different designs.
Yeah, it's such a cool one. I'm definitely going to steal that study and tell loads of people on the podcast now, because that's so nice. It's just so cool. It's one of the ones that you want to be true, and you know,
Right.
anecdotally, it feels true and everything. I'm really curious. So much of what you've discussed about the importance of music and bonding people and rhythm. I was having a conversation with Robin Carhart Harris, who's one of the leading psychedelics researchers in the world, and one thing that he's done a load of these psychedelic experiments, and one thing that he's struggled to do is tease apart the importance of music in the healing in these ceremonies and tease apart the psychedelics, but they seem so interconnected. And when you don't have the music, it doesn't really have the same effect. And when you have them together, they just seem so synergistic. Have you done any research with psychedelics? Have you thought about it? Because obviously there's so much overlap in the music space, and like psychedelics and music work together in I think ways and we don't really understand, but are clearly synergistic and interesting. And is this something you've thought about?
I absolutely love this question because I have a book coming out in May, actually. It's called Transported: The Everyday Magic of Musical Daydreams, and is really precisely about a kind of ordinary trippiness that comes from music. And there's a chapter in the book where I talk about the way that one of the very most dominant strains in music therapy comes directly out of psychedelics research. So there was a woman in sort of the mid 20th century who had been working in these clinics where they were administering LSD to people under these kind of careful environments. And she had been trained as a violinist prior to these experiences. And so was involved in kind of picking the music that people would listen to during these sessions. And noticed across the course of participating in them that so much of the imagery people reported during these episodes seemed to be very tightly tied to the music that was playing. And she started wondering exactly the question that you're asking. How much of this is actually coming from the music, and how much of it is coming from the drugs? And developed an entire method of music therapy that is basically exactly like what would happen in a session with LSD, but it's just music. You just come in and are played music and encouraged to imagine things across the course of a session. And this is kind of a still today a very common kind of global practice in music therapy. So there's, even in the way we think about what music does to people in clinical settings, the kind of model of psychedelics has been at the core of that and is super generative.
Yeah, yeah, I find this all super, super interesting. Are you aware of the literature on psychedelics and music, and how we talked a lot about the brain listening to music in normal circumstances, how that brain signature and brain activity changes on psychedelics?
Yeah, this is something that's happening really fast right now. Just over the last few years, as I'm sure you know, an explosion of research in this
Yes.
area. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that I'm most interested about there is this relationship between um, listening to music and kind of having the world around you seem to disappear a little bit, and you find yourself somewhere else, which you could imagine could have really important consequences, not just as an ordinary part of your, daily life, in terms of the same benefits we see from mind wandering and that kind of literature, but also in a case where you have anxiety or depression, and it's a truism that jolting yourself by going out and, taking a walk or something is good, but that's kind of a high barrier to entry if you're having trouble getting out of bed, right? Um, but if you can just kind of press play and have a song take you somewhere and provide new input and get you stuck out of these kind of stuck thought patterns. Again, that's the kind of intervention that is easily available, doesn't have scary side effects, doesn't cost a lot of money. And so it's all these kinds of indicators about, the potential of music as a tool in that way that are leading to some exciting global initiatives around not just psychedelics and music, but music and health and well-being and, all these kinds of questions.
What do you think could be the future of music therapy? Like, do you envision some sort of protocol that scans the brain using some sort of high resolution technology that maybe doesn't exist now, is able to locate some signature in that brain and then find the right music to pair with that brain in some way? Again, there's a lot of question marks here in terms of what those signatures would be, but do you think there is some sort of pairing of brain with music that you might be able to do, or you might be, maybe you just do it on taste and what they like, but is there something there that could be a little bit more deeper and maybe even more efficacious in the future?
It's so interesting because this is this kind of, if you look at this set of questions in the field and you dial it back to 30 or 40 years ago, back into the early 90s or something, now we're in Mozart Effect land. So I don't know if you know what I talk about, what I'm talking about. So what I mean is, if you go into a toy aisle, a baby toy aisle at a store, even today, and you press the little button that plays sound, you're likely to get a Mozart tune, more likely than any other kind of tune you might, and,
Right.
even there might even be a little picture of Mozart on the side of the box. This really goes back to this really influential paper in the early 90s where researchers had played college students clips of Mozart to piano sonata before they did a little spatial reasoning task, which is the thing where you have the shape and you say which one is a plausible rotation of the shape. And found that if people had listened to this Mozart 2 piano sonata, they did better on this spatial reasoning task than if they hadn't listened to music beforehand.
Wow.
And but it turned out that this was just an arousal effect, right? So you could listen to any kind of moderately upbeat music. You could walk on a treadmill. You're in a higher arousal, more attentive state, and you perform better in the short term on a kind of cognitive task. That's really all that was going on. But the idea that there was something magical about Mozart was so irresistible that it's proved really difficult to kind of dislodge from the public imagination.
Yeah.
And here in the US, in the decade following, we had things like the state of Florida, state legislature proposed a law that you could only be licensed as a daycare center in the state of Florida if you played students a minimum amount of classical music per day. Or in the state of Georgia, the governor was allocating funding
Really?
all new parents a Mozart CD so the little Georgians could grow up, brilliant.
Seems
And
bizarre.
Right. So that's, I mean, that's, these are not good outcomes. This is
Yeah.
bad public dissemination of science. And so I think when we, again, now reconnect with the present moment, where I think there really is very real potential for, applied good in the world from musical experiences, we want to learn from the mistakes of 30 years ago and be thoughtful about the kinds of individual differences, about the cultural situatedness of music and how that's actually feeding into its efficacy in clinical settings, such that if we kind of, just think about music as some series of abstract sounds, and if you just get the right cocktail of notes, magically health will happen. That
Yes.
model isn't quite right. So I think that's the trick there is finding ways to dose and dispense it in ways that actually, make sense and aren't this kind of like overly reductive application of the idea. And that's kind of
Right.
what I'm struggling with now.
Yeah. Playing Mozart to your baby in the womb was a thing for a long time, wasn't it? People would be like playing like up to their belly, 3 months pregnant, playing Mozart into the developing embryo. That was a thing for a while, wasn't it? Is there any evidence for that?
So it does seem like that there is, hearing develops relatively early in utero, and that, when newborns emerge, that they have some recollection of the kinds of sounds they've been exposed to in utero. But what I would object to is the idea maybe that there's something particularly magical about Mozart. In fact, we see really interesting evidence that just like in language, if you're not, if you stop being exposed to certain distinctions between phonemes in your language, you prune the ability to distinguish them. Same thing happens with all kinds of musical structures. So, uh, babies, you can, over the short term, expose them to some music with different kinds of meters than you might be used to in a US or UK context. So, these more complex meters that come up regularly in Balkan music. And babies, start out being able to process them well, lose that ability over the course of the first year unless they're exposed to it, even just over the course of a week, and then they regain it really rapidly. Whereas adults, we're just like, it's harder for us to learn a new kind of musical system. And we've kind of lost something about that window of plasticity. So maybe, in fact, one way of interpreting that literature is saying that exposure to lots of different kinds of music is perhaps advantageous
Right.
across the first
I
year.
was I was gonna say then what's the takeaway for raising a music prodigy? Just constant exposure to lots of different kinds of music on rotation, get them playing varied instruments, or maybe even just one thing and hyper specialize early on. Is there a neuroscience backed approach to raising a music prodigy?
One of the most interesting approaches to that kind of question comes from research on music and genetics. And so, for example, yeah, well, there's just a whole kind of burgeoning area of research there. But there's one finding that keeps coming out of it, which is that motivation to practice, motivation to learn seems to be the key differentiator. And in fact, maybe frustratingly, itself seems to be genetically encoded. Um,
Yes.
so what I think about when people ask me about kids and music, um, is whatever kind of gamifies it such that it's irresistible and intrinsically motivating to a kid to do. That's really the magic. And basically, when I've found teachers where I live who have this ability, that whatever instrument they're on, if people ask me, like, can you find me a piano or a violin teacher? I'm like, don't do that, play guitar, because there's someone down the road who makes it like incredibly fun to play the guitar.
Yes.
And for me, that's really the magic quality that a music teacher can have across the first decade or so.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Let's go into these musical daydreams because I find this part of your work really fascinating and a bit puzzling in that I don't know why you went in this direction because
Yeah.
it sort of just seems like a bit outside the box. But talk about musical daydreams and talk about this really interesting experiment that you ran cross culturally in China and America, and just unravel that bit for you, because this is all super interesting.
Yeah. Well, it all started for me with a really a failed pedagogical experiment. So I was teaching a class, an undergraduate class in the psychology of music. And what I wanted was an example where the first day people could see, wow, this is a really complex subjective experience. Having a science of this is going to be a challenge. We're going to need to figure out some really flexible, cool tools to do this right. So I just played people an excerpt of instrumental music that they were unlikely to have heard before. And I asked them to just tell me what they thought about while they listened. And I specially highlighted that they could say anything like, I'm thinking about a ham sandwich that I would like to have after class. I'm thinking about, whatever. And, finished. And the first person raised their hand and they said, I was just like picturing pirates battling a storm, at sea. And someone else was like, "Oh, totally, pirates." And then, like, everyone was saying pirates. And that, like, I was trained as a conservatory student, like, a pianist. This was pirates were not what was happening while I was listening, to that music, and it was so crazy to me that they were all saying the same thing, and that was really the beginning of a long experience where basically my students showed me and taught me how important these experiences of kind of going away from the sound in your internal world to some imagined memory or scenario or something was a huge part of how people were experiencing music, including music across multiple genres. So we wanted to understand this, because this was just something that I'd been experiencing anecdotally um, with my students. And thankfully, across this time, tools from machine learning, like a natural language processing, had been advancing such that now we could have an experimental paradigm where instead of playing people an excerpt and having them like press a button or do something very like restricted, we could give them a highly unconstrained task. We could just say, what story do you imagine while you're listening to this excerpt? And so people, doing this one at a time and, in a sound attenuated booth and just typing out what it is they imagined. It turned out that then we came back on the other side and looked, person after person. Not only was it very easy for them to imagine a story while listening, not only was that a very natural kind of response, but also they were imagining basically the same story to the same excerpts, even though we're not talking about excerpts that people have heard before. They're unfamiliar excerpts, including this works for music from some culture where people have never heard the music from that culture.
That's so
Um,
weird.
it's so weird. And it's so weird. And the first thing that happened was I had a colleague at Michigan State who worked in music perception, and his partner was a cognitive scientist who studied fiction. So I basically phoned a friend and I was like, what is going on? What do you think is happening? And they said, you know what, the students are talking to each other in the hallways, like this can't possibly be real, and had me
That was
send
kind of
them
my
my
first thought with the pirates. I was like, if someone leads you in that direction, they'd be like, oh yeah, pirates. I was definitely thinking about pirates, but they could have a very different idea in their mind of what they meant by pirates. And then it was sort of a cultural, again, they're kind of prompting each other. That was
converging.
my first thing as well.
That was my first thing too, which means
Yeah.
even before I did this whole experimental approach, I waited an entire year. I did the same thing in the next year's class, but I made them write it down, right? Because I was like, I will outsmart these undergraduates. And I just opened the paper and it was the pirates. Um, anyway, so yeah, my colleagues at Michigan State took this, ran it, called me a few weeks later, and it was just down to specific words being used. People in East Lansing, Michigan, were just saying the same thing for these same excerpts.
Bizarre.
And so we really wanted to understand what is going on. And one initial way in seemed to be, okay, what if we find a group of people where the exposure to media, for example, let's just start there, is really different. And I had a colleague at Chinese University of Hong Kong who had a relationship with a community in rural China where people speak Dong, have, really, for the most part, report no experience with Western media. We found like a few people who had, and then we could look separately at them. Anyway, so we went there, played these same excerpts to people. And in fact, we tried to pick excerpts that would be broadly parallel between our groups in terms of familiarity. So we had these like Chinese art music excerpts that people in this area did not listen to voluntarily or habitually, but like had some exposure to. And similarly, we had these kind of excerpts of Western art music that also our participants like didn't voluntarily listen to, but kind of had ambient familiarity with. So, and then we played both these sets of examples for both groups. And what we saw is that for US participants, and for participants in this rural part of China, uh, each group is having these very robust, predictable responses per excerpt, right? But what those responses are is like completely different, to the extent that there's one excerpt that US participants will almost to a person tell you sounds really sinister, like someone's in a house alone, if there's a murderer stalking them. And people in Demon in China um, were very adamant that it was a scene where you were outside having fun playing games with friends.
So interesting.
So that's the level that we're really talking. And then we came back and did a matching task where we play new people excerpts, and they had to pick which of two descriptions some other person had given for that excerpt. And if you give people in Demon, this village in China, stories that people generated in the U.S., even though when you ask people in the US to match it, it's trivially easy. They're like at ceiling. They're like 100%. It's obvious. And in fact, we're now doing this with kids. It's also trivially obvious to kids. Like kids do this at ceiling in the US, for within culture excerpts. But then you go across culture and people were at chance. Like that's the level of difference. So
Wow.
I think you're seeing there this relationship between culture, exposure, and these kinds of biological kinds of tendencies, that they're working in concert to generate very robust phenomenon that then look very different in how they play out across cultures to the same sets of sounds.
It's super interesting because I was not surprised at all that China differed from America, right? If there wasn't a difference there, that would be insane. I mean, the result's insane anyway, that there's some continuity in the American daydreaming, but mostly because I worked with an aphantasia company for a while. You familiar with
Oh, yeah,
aphantasia?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I talk about that in the book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is this is why I was super interested in this, is because there's so much variability in human imagination anyway. So like some people will be very image dominated, some people will be very, interoceptively dominated, some people will be very emotionally dominated, touch. It, so even just the way we imagine isn't one thing. All of these are variable dimensions, and we are massively different in these variables. So when there was consistency in the reports, was there a particular modality that was consistent? Was it mostly an emotion? Was it
Good
mostly a
question.
picture?
Great. Such a good question. It really seems to us it's grounded out in semantic concepts, like very concrete. Like I'll give you an example of a story people will say. They'll say, it's a city street in the 1920s. And there's a man, there's a woman walking ahead of him and he's kind of trying to chase her. He's like intrigued by her. Okay, that's like very concrete.
Hmm.
Or it's a meadow. There's a sunrise. People will say tiny creatures awaken and start to frolic. And even the word frolic will like go
What?
from person
What?
to person. And so another thing that I take from this is that what we experience as spontaneous thought is maybe more grounded in perception and in kind of memory and collective experience than we ordinarily acknowledge, and that music is a way, because it's this kind of structured ambient cue, we can kind of identify these patterns in a more robust way. But this is something we're really interested in now, is sorting out these differences in modality. And I think the
Yes.
instinct within studies about music, these responses to music, has been that it's quite visually dominant, which makes sense to a certain degree, because with sound, you're kind of like, withdrawing that dimension. And so people are supplanting it back. But it's something that we're very much engaged in looking at now. And I would say that, my student, Karen, really thinks that there's a big kinesthetic component to
Mm.
the imagining as well. So that's something else that we're looking at. We did use this in the scanner in a cool way because, once we'd done all this behavioral work, we had these excerpts where we knew what stories people were probably going to imagine to particular excerpts. So we recorded someone saying the stories verbally. And then we brought people into a scanner and either played them the excerpt, the musical excerpt, or the spoken recording of the story. And in both cases, we just asked them to imagine while they were listening. And so now we have this kind of matched ground truth that we hadn't had in kind of musical studies before that could help us kind of see into this higher order meaning making dimension. And we
Mm.
did see that there's these distinct patterns that emerge in the default mode network that are excerpt specific that really only show up when you have this kind of ground truth of the spoken story to match it to. But my collaborator had done a bunch of work on listening to stories and watching films in the scanner. And he was really interested because we were seeing all this area activation in visual areas that he had not been able to see in these other stories, which is that's not like formal, robust evidence, but it is like a little sign of that maybe there's something to your intuition that
Right.
there's a big visual component here.
Super cool. This is all really interesting. Is there a way to open source this? I'd love to do this myself, first off. Listen, I don't know if you just have a bunch of audio files that you ran these experiments on that you're able to give out so that I can listen and write down. Is there an instruction? Like, would this be possible for me to do with the listeners? I think the people at home listening right now, I think this would be really fun if we could do this and see if there's continuity. Because I have, listeners everywhere in the world. So I don't want to destroy your result if they all come back completely different. It's about 40% US, so I can stratify by geography. But
No,
this
that's
would be super
wonderful.
fun.
We've been working on gamifying this actually for several years. We do have a kiosk installed at a museum in Berlin where we're collecting data from lots and lots of people that are visitors. Um, but and we have one from a study that is not out yet, but we do have a fun interactive tool where you can this was about thoughts, not just stories, but music evoked thoughts. And you can kind of hover your mouse over the individual excerpts and hear it and see the consensus thought that people had for that. So over here is kind of music that sounds like robots, and over here is music that sounds like being alone sad on a beach.
Yes.
Kind of a visualization. Yeah, but let's scheme about how I
Yeah,
could
for
get you.
sure. For sure.
Yeah.
We can talk about that after because I'm really interested in that. Because I'd just be
Okay.
curious with my own results. I'm from Ireland and we get a lot of American influence, even though we don't like to admit it. So I'd be curious, what the overlap would be. Are you able to make sort of similarity matrices with these
Yes,
English
that's
speaking
exactly how we
dominant
would do it.
Western countries and see how
Yeah.
comparative they are based on these excerpts? Because again, I would have just guessed, my intuition would have been that mine would be completely different to everyone and they'd be utterly ridiculous or whatever.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be any consistency at all because again, there's just so much variance in human experience to start with. So the fact that you get an output that is somewhat consistent is kind of wild. And it does show
It-
how the level of cultural, cultural influence that there really is on everyone on a
yeah.
societal level.
Yes. And I want to say a couple things in response to that. One is that we were so interested in this, how surprising this finding is, people's intuitions that they're really subjective and idiosyncratic, and then the reality that everyone else imagined the same thing. Um, so we actually, specifically in response to that, developed and validated a creative agency scale where we measure the extent to which people feel like they had free will over these imaginings. And there's this interesting divide where people think it's theirs alone, but it's really this kind of shared
Right.
experience. And secondly, that this shows up in memories as well. So another student did a dissertation here at Princeton, Kara Turnbull, and used the same suite of methods to show that as a function of genre, there are also these shared sociocultural script kind of memories that crop up in individual descriptions people give of what music makes them remember. And then the third thing is that I have a close collaborator on this work called Kelly Jakubowski at Durham in the UK. And so a lot of the work that we've done together has half UK participants and half US participants. And I think at the beginning we really thought that would be a really interesting component to the work, and we'd see this, but it's strikingly similar
Wow.
across. And there are some genres where you can get things to pull apart a bit. An example is country music, which has a different, maybe, cultural embedding in the US compared to the UK, for example.
Yeah, I would have really no, I think, cultural association with country music, really. I am,
But it
that
turns
doesn't
out,
mean
you know what?
anything to me.
You'd surprise yourself because you probably do. It's
Yeah,
probably just very narrow, like whatever country music you get played, you probably imagine a narrow set of things. Like that's the kind of thing we find when a genre is unfamiliar, is that just the imaginings kind of get less specific per excerpt, and they're kind of generic per
that would
per genre.
truly astonish me if there was overlap between my cultural association of country music and, like, I don't know, a girl in Texas. I don't know where country music is big in America.
Yeah,
Again, it's not really a thing in Ireland particularly, so it's like I would have again, whatever association I do have is sort of deeply subconscious, and maybe
yeah.
something comes out and it's overlap, but that would astonish me really if there's this
Well,
if
to
there's
me, this shows the way, like, music is sort of a way in to this web of associations that we've developed by just being in the world. And so, kind of
yes.
what we're imagining is telling us something about ourselves and the experiences we share with other people. And I just find it a really interesting point of insight, even though it might seem kind of trivial, what occupies your mind when this sound comes on. I actually think there's a lot to learn from it, and it's a lot more interesting than it seems at first glance.
For sure. I don't think it's trivial at all. I think it's really interesting. I'm going to make another psychedelic comparison. I'm curious on your thoughts. So I was speaking again with Robin about why is it that when people take psychedelics, they often report the same hallucinations. So this is sort of on the same line of, like, why does someone in a rainforest in Brazil see an elf, and somebody in a beach house in California also see an elf? And we were talking about it, and his idea is that these are deep cultural union archetypes. So from, like, Carl Jung, like really deeply ingrained archetypes. So people will see, like, the great mother or the bad father, or these like cultural archetypes that could be ingrained in our brain evolutionarily, I think, in ways that we don't even fully understand. I'm curious, is there any parallels there between, again, because that's also a surprising finding to me. Again, why is there any continuity in these hallucinations? There shouldn't be, right? They're just random and they're hallucinations, but there is remarkable continuity in the things that people see when they're tripping on these drugs.
Mm.
Um, and I'm curious, is there a similar answer in the sort of deep subconscious cultural wiring that we don't fully appreciate that's going on under the hood?
So that's something one way that we've tried to look at that is trying to ask what's the range of you know, consensus story. So when we have a story that keeps coming up in response to an excerpt, we talk about that as the consensus story, right? And we do see that there are certain of these consensus stories that emerge in response to many different excerpts. And so, our question is, what's the lexicon of like, how big is it of consensus stories? How many different, shared stories can emerge in response to
Right.
music? What are the central ones? And I mean, this is maybe not surprising, but a chase scene is quite common, a quite common thing to emerge. And I mean, I'm not an expert in dream literature, but as far as I understand, that's also a pretty common topic to emerge in a dream. And then we also thought maybe these are just topics that show up a lot in movies. And we tried to look at databases of, movie tropes and see whether we're pulling maybe movie tropes out of people's musical imaginings. We couldn't quite find a fit there. And so this is kind of one of the places we're going by trying to collect in really large data sets so that we can answer questions like how far does this range go? What are its boundaries? And then, thinking about that as a starting point for creativity, because I don't want to give the impression that, you're hopelessly predetermined to whatever, cultural script comes to mind when you listen to music. Because you could think of another experimental paradigm where you say, okay, that was great. Can you try to imagine something else? And look at how people can or cannot, change and introduce more novel and creative kinds of things into the mental thoughtscape. So I think these are all like very lively questions that we're really curious about at this moment.
Yeah, I think I've some audience that will get in on this, and I think this would be a fun thing to do. In the Chinese example, were there consistency in their results with each other, not with America, but with each other.
Exactly. Yep, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. You saw it at two levels, the excerpt level, but also the music type level. So if you look at how the descriptions are clustering, um, both for US participants. So the US participants' imaginings are a separate cluster than the participants in Demon. But then if you look at the Chinese and the Western excerpts, those are also clustering within culture. So both in Demon and in US, people are imagining more similar scenarios in response to excerpts from a particular culture than they are to excerpts from another culture. And then there's, you know, stability then at the next level of the particular excerpt. So there's this kind of hierarchy of how these fantasies are organized.
What kind of cultures would you try this out in next if you were given a bunch of money and you could just do this anywhere? Like, what are the interesting test groups? Like, I'm thinking like monks and hermits and Amazonian previously uncontacted Amazonian tribes might be a bit hard. That one, they tend to shoot people with their bows when you go near them. But what are the interesting groups here where you can try and even tease this apart and go like, what's experiment round 2, round 3?
Yeah. So, one thing that is truly the case in the communities we're studying in China is that we already know that it's really normal for people to think there in terms of stories with music. So many, you know, uh, kind of stories within the community have songs associated with them. So there's this like natural fit that you can already see between storytelling and music. So it'd be particularly interesting to look in places where we don't see that, right? Where music doesn't have this as readily available of a storytelling function. And there are a number of massively cross-cultural studies that have happened in music recently. So there's some really cool ones where people have gone to like dozens and dozens of sites from small scale societies to major cities around the world and in all continents, I suppose except for Antarctica, and had people do things like just tap along, and seen really interesting cultural variation around kind of the basic rhythmic expectations that people bring to a piece of music. So I think most of the research has been at that level of like pitch perception, rhythm perception, tone matching, and being able to do something truly cross-cultural in this kind of meaning affective space is super enticing. But as you mentioned, expensive. We were only able to, in fact, do the research with China because we had like an NSF grant that, helped us do that. Uh, Especially because to do it right, you have to really have big coalitions and good relationships with people in the community, because otherwise you can, get this kind of surface level behavior that you misunderstand and interpret
Right.
in ways.
I
Yeah.
mean, you did a great job to even like, it's hard to find a large group of people in the world that don't have Western influence in any way. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
so to get rural China, when I read that, I was like, what the, why? But then it makes complete sense when you lay it out. You're trying to get as different a group in terms of cultural programming as possible.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
And I really like the emphasis on the cross cultural aspect. So much of science is done in these top institutions. The joke is like, nervous psychology students that are signing up for like these experiments for credits make up like a stupid amount of like all of the psychology findings, because like that's what I did in college. I just kept volunteering for these things because it was interesting. And, I was studying neuroscience. There was always, flyers on the wall like scan your brain, get a free beer, whatever it was. I was down for anything. Get a free Guinness and a brain scan. I mean, incredible. But it just means that like it's hard to generalize from those data sets or know exactly how you can generalize from those data sets. Does it apply to, a rural village in China? So like there's obviously so much logistical issues and constraints with doing that. But I just think that's such a important emphasis to have, that we need to do more cross-cultural work.
Yeah, and I'm really proud of the area of cognitive science of music in particular, because people have really been working in recent years. There have been initiatives led by Nora Jacobi at Cornell and by Pat Savage in New Zealand, to expressly build these kinds of consortiums that, deeply involve people in a whole range of communities at multiple level in generating the research questions themselves, so that it's, not this kind of like fly in with a hypothesis and like not know what's going on and fly out, but that it can be really, and music's a great starting place for this to happen more broadly in psychology and neuroscience, because it's such a culturally embedded phenomenon that requires that kind of textured understanding to research well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think this might be a bit of a out of field question to finish, but there's a big emphasis on the podcast on consciousness, sort of the ultimate mystery of science. Do you
Mm.
think we can learn anything about consciousness from music?
So, right. So, I mean, I think that the entry point to questions about consciousness that comes from music, in my mind, has to do just with phenomenology, um, and just literally what it is like to listen to music
Yes.
compared to what it is like to have other kinds of experiences. And yeah, so there's like a tiny corner of the music world that's doing stuff that engages directly with kind of consciousness studies. But it's not, I mean, there's a lot of room there, I think, for um, more connection in the future. I think it's a super interesting direction.
I'd love to connect you with Dr. Russell Hurlbert. He's the inventor of the experience sampling method. So
Yes.
I did this for 10 weeks, where I carried around this box. I don't have it on me, and it beeped me at random moments, and
Right.
I had to write down my experience. And
Yes.
that that would be super interesting to do with music. Because again, it
Yes.
kind of goes past like you.
People have used this with
Yeah.
music in various
Yeah.
ways. Yeah, and I'm just thinking, there's someone in the UK Ruth Herbert has done a bit of this in terms of thinking expressly about consciousness. Yeah, but I love this like outside the laboratory, real world way that gets into. There are also people doing interesting things now, like putting microphones in households and measuring all the sound that people, in the case I'm thinking about, tiny people, newborns in the first 1,000 days of life, it's in a project that's led by some of my colleagues here at Princeton. Um, and they're really trying to look at what babies are able to do as a function of the acoustic input that they get across that. So, this is a case where even more than experience sampling, it's just like they're not sampling, they're just taking it all. They're just
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
of the entire background.
That's
Um,
a really all-encompassing experiment to try and like map the entire acoustic landscape of a developing child for like multiple years. Like
It's
that's a
so wild. They're trying to do things like predict babbling patterns as a function of the acoustic input kids have gotten. And there's someone in Oregon called Caitlin Fossey who's done this a bit with music as well, tracking just like what does the musical environment look like if you really measure it across long periods for young children. And so I think all of that kind of sort of big data approach is going to be something that yields really interesting insights over the next
Yeah.
few years as
Where do you hope this field goes, music cognition? Again, you have just been awarded a $10 billion grant with a blank. You write whatever on it. Like, what would you do? Like, what's really cool in this area? What's interesting? Like, what technology would you use? What kinds of experiments would you like to run?
I think that it is all about shifting from averages as the point. This is a thing that Lisa Feldman Barrett talks a lot about too, shifting from averages as the default, um, focus of analysis to variability as the default focus of analysis. And
Mm.
so much you can learn from techniques and modeling that people use in ecology and evolutionary biology, with a complex, culturally situated, yet ubiquitous, culturally universal phenomenon like music, where if you've really got these large cross-cultural data sets, that you can really learn super interesting things about the way that the environment and the brain are kind of co-constitutive and interacting, and in ways that I think could really drive cognitive science forward more broadly.
Super cool. Elizabeth, this has been so much fun. Really, really enjoyed it. Time has flied. Thank you so much for your time. Your work is so interesting. I can't wait for your book to come out and to read it. I think let's try running an experiment together. We'll get the giant shoulder audience all
That'd be so wonderful.
writing stories about music and see if there's any continuity. That would be super cool. I'd love to do that. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free